Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. This is Season 3, Episode 125, and I am Ramjee Chandran. The story till now. When the 1792 attack of Srirangapatna by Charles Cornwallis ended, Tipu was left with half his kingdom, less than half his income sources, and a huge tribute to be paid to the British, who held his two sons ransom. And Mysore's arch rivals, the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad, now had a large part of Mysore territory that had been carved out of the kingdom. What Tipu had been left with was territory that was not the most revenue generating and ports that were more military than commercial, but he was still the Sultan of a powerful and functioning kingdom that was not without prospects for the future. All that said, in this episode, I raised the question that sits underneath all of that. Charles Cornwallis chose to leave Tipu Sultan on the throne. Was it not the logical thing for the British to have simply annexed Mysore as they did in 1799? This episode looks for answers. But before anything else, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, for their corporate support. They make this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. To many people, both the supporters and the detractors of British and Tipu, the same question lingers then as it did today. Why did Cornwallis leave Tipu Sultan with a kingdom to run? Why did they not simply take him out? For those who might remember the first Iraq War, a similar question was asked of George Bush Sr. and the Americans for why they stopped short of the invasion of Baghdad in 1991, leaving Saddam Hussein in place. George Bush I and the Americans had their reasons in 1991, as Cornwallis had 2 centuries before, in 1792. There were many reasons in 1792 that prevented the British under Cornwallis from considering the outright annexation of Mysore. And one rather implausible reason that I will actually begin with. Now, in some analyses, I have seen it mentioned that the British did not have the mechanism to administer the kingdom of Mysore. They say that the British had an army, that the army was not an instrument for governing a country. Conquest and administration are separate things, and they require different men, different institutions, different kind of expenditure. And the cost of conquest is incurred once, and the cost of administration is forever. That would be required of Cornwallis in the morning after an annexation. It raises a question, could he have done it? He would have had to have occupied the major centers of the kingdom, to have garrisoned the forts, and Mysore had many forts across the kingdom. He would have to hold communications across a plateau that was said that his officers barely knew, and that he would have had to build a revenue administration where the East India Company had none, which means assessors, collectors, records, and courts. And finally, he would have to decide what to do with all the Mysorean officials who understood the existing system and had every reason to resent the British and resist them. So he would have to keep order among a population that had been governed by Mysore for generations and have a large enough army to hold all of it together. Now, in my view, all of this argument that the British were not ready for administration should be immediately questioned, if not dismissed. If anything, the British knew administration. They had well-established presidencies in Calcutta and Madras and already administered large tracts of Indian territory. And if there was one thing they understood immediately, it was bureaucracy. They had set up the administration of Bangalore, for example, as soon as it was taken in March 1791, and we know this from previous episodes. They had managed to get all the palegars on their side and had immediate access to all the officers who knew the districts, survey the land, make an assessment of the revenue, and everything else that nations do when they take over kingdoms. Remember that already a large part of the Mysore kingdom was theirs now. The entire Baramahal area went to them and would stay with them permanently until India got independence. So to think that they would have fought shy of annexing Mysore because they were daunted by the prospect of administrating the rest of it is nothing short of absurd. So let's put that to rest. And now, let me simply and quickly lay out why it was not prudent for the British to have occupied the rest of Mysore. There were three overarching reasons why. First, the current interests of the British. The British were here to serve a larger strategic interest, and that's why they took Bangalore. But the mission objectives, in other words, to prioritize their real interest, was in the bigger picture. And this included building secure borders around what they had just acquired and needed to create a stronger defensive frontier so that they could hold what they took. The second reason was how to handle the allies in the war, the Marathas in Hyderabad, and that was the other practical problem. Remember, the British had not fought this war against Tipu Sultan alone, and they had equal partners, the Marathas in Hyderabad. They could not just start taking unilateral action like annexing the entire country without attracting their attention. Their usefulness had ended the moment Tipu had sued for peace. They had been given the territory they had wanted, and now they needed to be shaken off. The third broad reason that I give was mandate. The British, specifically in this case the East India Company, were under strict guidelines on the annexation of territory, and the 1792 Mysore battle did not rise to that occasion. So these were the three main concerns. But what is interesting is that all these three considerations were linked in many ways that led to the creation of the British Empire in India after the fall of Mysore. So let's get into this rather interesting look behind the scenes. Let me take the first of them, the question of what the British were actually trying to achieve. Wars are fought for objectives, and the objective of this battle was never the acquisition of Mysore, it was merely the removal of a danger called Tipu Sultan. Mysore had been an unbeatable foe, the only Indian kingdom to have actually defeated the British army in 2 wars and effectively frustrated 2 attempts by the British to take over Bangalore. The Battle of Polilur in 1780 was something that the British would never forget, and logically, that was the memory that Cornwallis was working to erase. The Carnatic was the company's most valuable possession in the south, and Madras was the seat of the government. Twice in 12 years, a Mysore army had descended from the Ghats at high speed, done enormous damage in the place, and withdrawn even before a British force could be assembled to meet it. So the objective of the battle against Tipu, therefore, was to make certain that this could never happen again. Cornwallis said as much himself in a routine report that he wrote to Charles Oakley, who was the governor of Madras, and Cornwallis wrote on the 22nd of February 1792 these words: "Those whose passions are heated and who are not responsible for consequences will probably exclaim against leaving the tyrant an inch of territory, but it is my duty to consult the real interest of the company and the nation." This was Cornwallis explaining why he left Tipu on the throne. Now notice the standards that he set over there. He wasn't talking about this battle being vengeance or the total humiliation of an enemy, and not the acquisition of as much territory as victory could be made to yield. The real interest he spoke of was the East India Company, which was the front for the British. And Cornwallis draws the distinction between that interest and the appetite of a people who would not be responsible for the consequences of satisfying it. And these were men who sat on the sidelines and said, "Finish off Tipu," without looking at the reality on the ground. So, what did that real interest of the British consist of? Principally, it was a frontier. Let's look at what the British took and the shape of it. The Baramahal and Salem on the eastern side and towards the southeast of Bangalore, and that commanded all the passes into the Carnatic. And then skip across to the west coast, they took Coorg, and Coorg held all the routes to the mountains and to the west and to Malabar, which actually took the whole coast. Now, these were not the 4 richest districts available for the taking, but they were the 4 that closed the doors for Mysore and for anyone else who might have designs on them. Mysore was to belong to the British. And every one of these routes sat on a road that the Mysore army would have to use and now was denied to them. And that is what makes Cornwallis' settlement with Tipu a piece of deliberate work rather than a scramble for whatever was going on and take all that you can. Tipu was left with an army, a treasury, and a capital. What he was not left with was the ability to bring that army down off the plateau before anybody could stop him, as he had done many times in the past. That capability that had made Mysore dangerous to British India had been taken away from him without a single additional acre of the interior being occupied. Now, Cornwallis put this comparison somewhat plainly. The arrangement he had obtained, he argued, effectually destroyed the dangerous power of Tipu, and it did so more beneficially and at less risk than the capture and the occupation of Srirangapatna would have done. Now, once the frontier was secure, in other words, the plateau added nothing to the objective. And that is the detail of the first of the three reasons, and it was the one that the British could act on entirely by themselves. The second was not. And this involved having to come to terms with the fact that they were not alone in this battle and that they had partners. And now for a quick commercial break, and when I get back, let's look at the rest of the reasons why Cornwallis didn't take Mysore. Right after this. Before I go on from here, we need to remind ourselves that the war that had just ended at Srirangapatna was not exactly entirely a British war. It had been fought by three powers under a treaty of alliance: the British, the East India Company, they being the same thing, the Maratha Confederacy on the second part, and the Nizam of Hyderabad on the third. All three had armies in the field in the final campaign. All three had entered the war as equal partners. The partners had been brought over by the British to join their conflict with clearly defined terms for the payout if they won. That is the situation in which Cornwallis had to write the peace treaty, and he was in no mood to actually go foul of all these things and decided that he needed to act in an honorable way. Now, even if the Allies had received the territories that they wanted, and which they did get, the terms of their agreement would have changed entirely if the British had not told them that they were going to depose Tipu and take over Mysore, and had gone ahead and done so. Everything would have changed for the Marathas and Hyderabad in such a case, not the least having to contend with the British right now, right on their borders. And for this reason, there was no confidence in the British camp that the demands of the Marathas and Hyderabad would not have now changed, included asking as equal partners for a larger piece of the Mysore territory than they had actually received. Had the British taken the whole of Mysore, neither of them would have signed the peace settlement, and neither of them was in any position to be told to accept it, again, being equal partners. The even greater reality was that the Marathas in particular were not exactly junior partners in the arrangement, even if such a thing could be said about the Nizam of Hyderabad. The Maratha Confederacy was one of the great military powers of India at the time, and it held an enormous part of the subcontinent already, and it had joined the war for reasons that had nothing to do with their interest in British security. Mysore had, over the years, acquired territory and wealth that the Marathas had coveted, and this was their opportunity to take a share of it. Had the company announced an annexation, the Marathas would have asked with complete justification why they had supplied armies so the British could take everything for themselves. The Nizam would have asked the same question, although with less force behind it. Now, Cornwallis understood these realities very well. He had judged that the total overthrow of Mysore would excite violent jealousy on the part of the Marathas, who were, in his assessment, watchful and clear-sighted about their own interests. And then he took the view that leaving Tipu in place with a defined and partitioned territory would make the final settlement among the Allies considerably easier to conclude. So the division of Mysore was not a matter of Cornwallis deciding how much land Britain would like to have. It was a negotiation over the spoils of a coalition war, conducted with two partners who had their own courts to answer to, with their own accounts to settle. A partition could be agreed because it gave each of the three something to take home, and this was something that they had agreed upon. An annexation could not, because it gave one of the three everything, more than they had ever said that they would take. Now there's a second and colder consideration lying underneath the first. A weakened Mysore was actually useful for the British, And the reasoning runs something like this. The British possessions of the south were exposed. Truth be told, the British in the south, if you take into account Baramahal, the Kongu regions, the Coromandel districts and Coorg, now were the most formidable power in India. Up north and to the west was the Maratha Confederacy. Now between Maratha power and the British south lay the kingdom of Mysore, which meant that Mysore was not just an enemy, it was also a state that stood in the way of harm. If they removed it from the map entirely, they don't really create an empty country. They would have created a long shared frontier between the British and the Marathas with nothing between them at all. So any settlement that Cornwallis may have engaged in was calibrated. It was not maximized for territory. Tipu was to be left strong enough to hold his own ground and defend himself against any kind of an attack from the Marathas, but weak enough that he could never again threaten British territory, and weak enough further that the British could step in whenever they wanted and turn the scale between him and his neighbors. That was a considerably more useful arrangement for the British than an entire conquest. And this was achieved by taking half a kingdom rather than all of it. None of which was a consideration for Tipu Sultan. For the British, this was strategic geography. It was the same logic that in 1790 made the Marathas useful as allies was now a problem in 1792 once the objectives of 1790-1791 had been met. And all this brings us to the third reason, and this is the shortest reason of all. The East India Company was not a sovereign government. It was a chartered commercial corporation exercising power of war and revenue in India under the supervision of British Parliament and its own court of directors in London. Both had issued standing orders at this point in time, and these instructions were explicit. Offensive operations undertaken for the aggrandizement of territory at the expense of other Indian states were prohibited to the East India Company. Now, that had not prevented expansion either before 1792 or after it, but it did mean that a Governor-General, who was an appointee directly by the Crown, had to be able to present what he had done in terms of security and necessity rather than just acquisition for profit. Cornwallis had to be able to show a case. So for the settlement that Cornwallis finally made, that case wrote itself. Mysore had been dangerous. It had made war on British possessions. It had been defeated. The frontier below the Ghats needed protection and now had it. So the company had been compensated for the enormous cost of fighting, and every one of those propositions could be demonstrated on paper in London, and so therefore Cornwallis was safe. But complete annexation of Mysore could not have been presented in those terms at all. Once the danger had been removed and the compensation received, what was left to point to? The war had been justified as a defensive necessity, and a defensive necessity doesn't extend to absorbing an entire kingdom whose capacity to threaten had been decimated. And here's the connection that I mentioned earlier, which I think is the most interesting thing in this whole settlement. Two of the three constraints that I talked about were political rather than material. The allies had to be accommodated because the alliance was still an alliance. The mandate had to be respected because London was still watching. And as an aside, let me tell you that for having violated this kind of a mandate, Warren Hastings, Cornwallis's predecessor, was right now at that moment in London going through a trial for having ignored it. Neither constraint had anything to do with what the British could physically do in South India at that point in time, which means it wasn't permanent either. Alliances can be dissolved, mandates can be reinterpreted, and the men who interpret them could be replaced. Such is realpolitik. Now let me put the 5 reasons that I had mentioned before together. First, annexation served no purpose that the settlement didn't already serve the British. If the objective of war was to remove the danger, being Mysore, that had been achieved. Number 2, they were not alone. The Marathas and the Nizam had helped them win the war and would have expected a greater share of Mysore had Mysore been annexed by the British. Third, a reduced Mysore was actually useful as a barrier between the British and the other great powers of the Deccan. Fourth, the British could secure what mattered without taking everything, and the territories they acquired closed all the passes off to Mysore and strengthened their frontier. And fifth and final, once the war could be presented as a defensive necessity and it was brought to a successful conclusion, there was no compelling political case for complete annexation. So 1792 was not exactly a missed opportunity to annex Mysore. It was an opportunity that would not be taken. Very often, the actions of Cornwallis have been described as a settlement of imperial restraint, but truth be told, it was not that either. This was typical colonial language designed to make the British sound lofty and noble, but at no point in time did they display anything else but the pragmatism of traders who only look for a profit. And for that reason, the question which is the premise of this episode, why didn't Cornwallis take Mysore, needs to be asked from the position of 1792 and not from any later position after that year. The British, who stood outside Srirangapatna in February 1792, did not yet possess the India that they would possess only 7 years later, when they killed Tipu Sultan. 7 years later in 1799, the British did annex Mysore, but a great deal happened in between 1792 and 1790 time. Tipu Sultan, driven by the loss of the Third Anglo-Mysore War and the loss of half his kingdom, motivated himself in ways that are hard to describe. But what is easy to describe is the sort of action that all this drove him to, and that is what I will do in a series of exciting episodes that are coming up after this. So, watch this space. I am Ramjee Chandran and this is the history of Bangalore.